Hello and welcome to this video lecture on Chapter 5. Today we'll be talking about data processing. So in the opening vignette you might see somebody express that they don't have a quick way to track the data about the videos. And so this illustrates the need for a video database, and they want to be able to track down exact footage when equipment is stolen, and the way they're currently doing it is very time consuming. And so one database that they might be able to use is one called MongoDB, and so that allows you to track video files. And you're probably going to see more and more databases that will allow you to put huge video files in there, and then you could just search for a clip of whatever you're looking for. And so you're going to have some understanding of databases. When we're doing any type of business, we're storing that information. It has to be stored for a certain amount of time, and so that's what we're talking about today is will the databases allow you to store the information that you'll need in order to do your activities or the processes that you want. And so you need to have some understanding of the different types of databases that are out there, and then be involved in that conversation when people are actually choosing a database for your organization. So we've got some different questions that this chapter will hopefully answer for you throughout. Hopefully after you get done watching this video lecture and reading the chapter, you'll be able to answer these very easily. So the first thing is why do you need to know about a database? Well, one reason is for what I just mentioned. Can it help you reach your goals? Will it help you manage your processes better? Databases are everywhere when you're doing business. You're collecting all this data, and so can you turn it into useful information? So we've talked about information before, and we'll probably talk about it again, but when you put some kind of meaning on the data, then it becomes information. As your business grows and changes, you're going to need to have some kind of database structure that will grow and change with what you're doing in your business. You don't want to have a database that dictates to you what your processes are going to be because it can't handle anything else. An example that I've run into just recently would be if I need to track certificates, does Banner and TopNet have the ability to track certificates? Will it show up on an ICAP report? And so if we're not tracking that information, it's not going to show up on the report, and then that makes it difficult to advise and make sure that students are finishing the correct classes that they need. Now chances are you may not have to build a database from scratch, but you might have to help assist someone who's building a database and say, well, I need these features, or can we collect this information? And then they'll have to go in and modify the database and then generate a new interface for you. So you may ask yourself, what's the purpose of a database? It helps you keep track of everything. It allows you to generate reports. It allows you to make predictions if you're using the data correctly. And so prior to databases, you just had a regular file that you might keep track of. Examples of things that we've done, you really haven't seen a list yet, is that you would have in a spreadsheet you might keep track of a bunch of different items across the top, so those column headings, and then data underneath each of those column headings that are associated with those names at the top. So when you have a spreadsheet like that, that's called a flat file database, and it's just regular text. You could put in multiple rows that have the same information. There's nothing to prevent you from that. If you're keeping track of where somebody lived and you're keeping track of their addresses, if they changed addresses, you could just put in another row that has their name and their address, city, state, and zip. But then what happens to the previous one? Well, the previous one should have been deleted, but it may not have. A database is going to prevent you from doing that, and a database would also set it up so that you could track multiple addresses as long as they were accurate and current. Now, with a database, you would have a particular database that has a theme or a concept, if you would. So this theme would mean all the data that's related to this idea would be in this database. So example might be, you might have all the student grades, so that's associated with each course, the student emails, student office visits, you'd have also student addresses, and so on. All of that would be in this one database. So you could think of a database as different types of tables that would have this information in it. And so you wouldn't want to put it all in one big table, you would want to break that up. And that's the concept behind a relational database. That's what Access is. That's what SQL Server is. And say a big database like Oracle. So here we have an example of a single theme where we might have field names at the top, or column names, and then the data underneath. So that's what I was talking about earlier. But the problem with this is then how do we associate, say, student name with their emails and their office visits? Are we going to just add more fields out here to the side, or is there a way we can link all this and still see the information? So that's how a database helps out with this. So here we have a interface of a form, and so we have this initial information, and so it's student name, numbers, things that we saw on the previous page in a spreadsheet kind of list like. But then we have another output here that's keeping track of the email for this particular student, and it's also keeping track of the office visits for this particular student. So as I change the name here, then the links down here would also change. And so I've got records in each one of these tables, and you might think of a record as a row. And then I have 8 records of students all together. So if this were live, I could click this button and go to the next student, and then this would cause all this to change. And this is an Access interface, so this is what Access Database does. So conceptually, behind the scenes, there's some database terminology you need to understand. So rows are called records. It's easy to remember, R and R. And you typically have columns. The columns are going to be your fields, and then you have a field name. That's usually what's listed at the top. A student number would be a primary key, and so every record should have a primary key if you want to link it to something else, that is, link it to another table. So this primary key would have been linked to another table just like this one that contained the emails for that student. But in this case, the student number primary key can only be listed once. So a primary key has to be unique for each record. When I use the same data in another table, and I have a field called student number in that other table, these values could repeat, but they'd still link to, say, the different emails someone might have. So let me go back to the previous slide. So here we have this student number. Well, you don't see that student number out to the side here, but it's listed here, and you have 2 records that match. So in that case, in this particular table, that student number could be called a foreign key. And so there's a different primary key for these records that you're not seeing here. Same thing for office visits. So I'm linking that to this student number here in a foreign key field. So the only information that I'm repeating would be the student number in each of these tables. So the relationship is built on student number. So if we were to go to the next slide, we would see we would have a bunch of different tables, and those tables then can be broken down into having records and rows, or rows, fields, which would be your columns, and then each character, which would be a group of related characters, becomes a byte. So you might think of the hierarchy of data goes a bit, a byte, a group of related characters forms a field or column, a group of related fields or columns forms a record, a group of related records forms a table, a group of related tables forms a database, a group of related databases forms a data warehouse. And so that's the hierarchy of data then. So as I just mentioned, then a group of related tables or files forms a database. And there's relationships among those tables through the rows based on that particular key, if you would. Now, one table will be a primary key, and the other table will be a foreign key. So then this database also has other tables that contain metadata. So that's data about the data. So sometimes when we specify those columns, we have to specify, okay, what kind of data can go in this column? How wide can the column be? Is there any kind of formatting that needs to take place? Can the user type in anything, or do we want to limit it to what they can do? So that's what the metadata contains. So visually, this is what it means to have those relationships. So I might have an email table. So here's the primary key here. We have a student number. Notice that here it's allowed to repeat. I have that data that's repeating, and that's linked to the student table with this primary key. So this would be a foreign key column here, and this would be a primary key column. And then if I wanted to look up office visits again, here is the foreign key column, and it could repeat, but here we just have one record in this particular table. And so here is its primary keys, the values. Now when you interact with a database, you're probably interacting with a database management system, and a database management system does more than just the database. It's going to help you create reports, it's going to help you create forms, it's going to do queries for you or allow you to do that, and so you'll see all that when we start using Access. So one of the first things you got to do before you ever put in data in a database is you got to create a structure, and that structure is usually the table to hold the fields, and then it holds the data. Now you can use different types of generators to help you build those. It just asks you questions and you type it in, or you can open up a dialog box and type in the information. So you don't have to do it, say, from a command prompt. Right. There's also, with the database management system, you're going to be able to process the database. That is, you're going to be able to run transactions. That is, as one thing's changed, you're going to update certain tables, and then when the transaction completes, you'll update other tables. You also have to have the ability to administer the database. So you can't just let everybody get into every table or area of the database. There might be sensitive information like payroll or human resources that only certain people should have access to. So this is somebody who needs to administer the database from that standpoint. There's also someone who administers the database from an efficiency standpoint. So they're doing things like indexing fields and making sure nothing is stopped based on a transaction that's halting things. Some different types of databases that are out there. You'll hear some from IBM, Microsoft, and Oracle. If you're looking for an open source, but I think it's still open source, but I think it was acquired by Oracle recently, is MySQL. So you can use it for free based on certain restrictions, and a lot of people who are looking for open source software will go with MySQL. Here's an example of creating that initial structure in Access. This is also, it contains the metadata. So here we have field names we're going to put in here. These become your column headings, right? That's going to be your fields that you have. Then you're going to have the data type. You have to specify what kind of data can go in there. So a database is going to keep you from putting in wrong information in your columns. You don't have that feature in a spreadsheet. And then you're going to specify some other descriptive information about those field names. So in this case, we're letting email none be our primary key. You'll notice that when you can do that, there's a little key icon out to the side here. So you have to do something a little special in Access in order to specify a primary key. Then notice down here you've got more information about this particular field. It's telling me if it displays on the screen, we're going to use an input mask, so you're only asking for numbers. It's going to come up with today's value, so it's borrowing from Excel in terms of a function here, and that's the same function that's built into Access. Some basic operations that you use when you're using a database management system, and this is for the records. So you're looking at a table, maybe you want to restrict access to only be able to read so you can look at the data. If you want to be able to just add a record, you want to be able to insert. If you want to be able to modify a record that's already there, there's a modify operation. And then maybe you want to give somebody access delete. So these are the main process operations that you can do to each record. And these also are related to the types of security that you would have on a database. Maybe certain people only need to look at the data, but you don't want to allow them to modify the data in any way. In each database management system, you have the ability to query the database. And query means you're going to run a question. You want to find out some answers to some questions that you want to ask. So one way to do that is to use a language called SQL. And SQL is used on most relational databases, and so if you learn it, then you can do your own queries. Otherwise, you're going to have somebody else do the query for you, or you're going to use some kind of interface that allows you to put in kind of what you're looking for and then run it, and then it generates the output that you would want in your report. Now in this case, we're using SQL to do an insert operation. So it's actually the keywords insert, into, and then you put the table that you want there. Then you put in the values that you want. So student number, student name, these have to go in brackets because these field names have spaces in them. So you're saying, here's the field names that I want to insert. And then you provide keyword values, so this 1000 goes into this one. Franklin, Benjamin, it's in quotes, goes into student name. Homework 1 gets this, homework 2 gets this, and midterm gets this. So this is how you would do it if you were at the command prompt, just to enter it in. Otherwise, you got a form on the screen and you just type this information in, you hit enter, and in behind the scenes, it's running the SQL to insert that into a table somewhere. So if you're in Access and you need to add stuff in this case, we're showing an example of modifying the structure of the table. We want to add in a new column or field. We just go into this area here, we type in what we want, the data type, and then provide some description that we want. It's fairly easy when we're using a database management system. Now, I've mentioned some other activities of administering the database, and so one is doing the security, also doing any passwords, any permissions, but something we haven't talked about is doing a backup of the database. So this may be something you want to run continuously. I think if I've read things in the past that says Amazon sort of continuously backs up their database as it's working. you may not need to spend that kind of money and have that kind of infrastructure for backing it up. You may want to back up maybe a couple of times a day or once a day. And so when you're doing the backup, this may help improve performance if you're doing that sort of activity along with doing your backup, and you're looking for duplicate records if you're not tracking that immediately. So you may want to remove unwanted data. So when I say remove unwanted data, that might be data that you started collecting but it didn't quite finish, and you know that it didn't become a transaction, so you need to delete it. You really don't want to save that. So that might be where you're tracking, maybe somebody's buying something off the web and they're in a form and they provide information, but for some reason they abandon the form and do not go ahead and go through with the purchase. So you may have been collecting that data, putting it into a database, but then all of a sudden you're not needing it. So that's a temporary file or temporary data, and you delete it when you're running your backups and make sure that that's not being collected. So the person that would do this for an organization is called a database administrator, and so that's what DBA stands for. So you might have a DBA person in your organization. They're just in charge of the database. That could be one person or a group of people that are in charge of all your data. Typically you might have a steering committee that oversees this, so that not just one person is doing everything with the data and can access this. Some people have multiple DBAs and only allow access to certain portions by one DBA, and then the other DBA doesn't have access to the other. So you can think from a security perspective, if you're collecting all this information on your customers, would you really want somebody to be able to go in there and make a copy of that and sell it to your competitors? So you have to have some security features in there to prevent those sort of activities from taking place. Now these DBAs are going to help you either develop programs or develop procedures and give you a data model of what you're trying to incorporate into the database, and then they'll actually help you with the application design, and so that becomes the interface or the front end, if you would. And so a lot of times the database is referred to as the back end of an application. The interface is referred as the front end of an application. So here's a continuation of the different things a database administrator might do in terms of what they're required to do for operations, any kind of backup and recovery, any adaptation that they have to do. So I'm going to go ahead and pause it here so your video won't be that long, and we'll come back and start a new video.